Welcome to this brief video about the American founding, the Constitutional Convention, the ratification debates, and constitutional design today. After independence is declared in 1776 with the Declaration, there are 13 independent sovereign republics. They have all become their own little parliaments. These independent states begin writing state constitutions that are heavily influenced by republicanism, the idea that the people are sovereign and that through a powerful legislature they will pursue the general welfare. They are also inspired by liberalism, which aims to limit government power to protect individual rights. But these state legislatures are not small governments simply because they are limited. They are very powerful. A limited government can be big. Power is limited by virtue of having parameters. The state legislatures that are created in the 1770s are not small, though they are limited. The first national constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was written in 1777 and ratified in 1781. This first constitution created a confederation between the states, a confederate system. In the confederation, the individual states are sovereign. All political power initially exists with the states. Any power the national government has is derived from the states. The states choose to give some of their power to the national government, similar to a social contract style agreement. The first national government is very limited in its power and also small in size. There is a unicameral single-chamber Congress where each state has one vote regardless of population. This Congress does not have the ability to raise tax revenue or regulate interstate commerce, two issues that will become increasingly important in the years to come. The first national government quickly proves problematic, as the Congress cannot pay for the even limited number of responsibilities it has, due to its inability to raise tax revenue. The national government clearly lacks desirable economic and even foreign policy powers. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention convenes with the intention of revising and amending the Articles. The initial goal was to stick with the Confederation, but delegates began to design an entirely new system and constitution instead. The framers decide to replace the Confederate system with what is now called a federal system. Like the Confederate system, the federal system will have two levels of government, national and state. But in the federal system, state and national government will share power, and the national government will become much more powerful than before. Most importantly, states are no longer independent sovereign entities within the federal system. Within the federal system, both the national government and the state governments derive their power directly from the new federal constitution. It is no longer the case that the national government derives its power from the states. The goal of the framers is to give the national government more power, but to also preserve as much state power as possible and prevent the new national government from abusing its power. This is a lofty and difficult goal to accomplish. Constitutional design is going to become immensely important. Some of the framers had become critical of how powerful the state legislatures had become, evidence perhaps of too much republicanism, too much popular sovereignty. So they design a new national government in a far more liberal and conservative manner. Even though they are going to give the new national government more power, they are going to place more restrictions on that power and attempt to structure the government in such a way that individuals will be unable to abuse power and oppress others. After the new federal constitution is drafted, there is a nationwide debate over whether the new constitution should be ratified. Is this new national government going to be too powerful? This debate over whether the new Constitution gives too much power to the national government is referred to as the ratification debates. The ratification debates take place in the press, in newspapers. Federalists, those who support the new Constitution, wrote persuasive essays aiming to convince the public of the federal system's benefits. Federalists such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were the most influential spokesmen for ratification. In Federalist number 51, Madison responded to anti-Federalist fears that the new national government would become tyrannical by explaining how the federal system's design would prevent abuses of power and protect both states' rights and individual rights. Madison concedes that the ideal way to prevent abuses of power would be an active citizenry with Republican virtue, holding politicians accountable, protecting the system from corruption, ambition, and greed. But he also knows that the people will not have sufficient virtue, so he designs the government in such a way that the system will, to a great extent, regulate itself. This is what is meant in Federalist 51 by ambition will counteract ambition. The separation of powers and checks and balances within the national government will trigger a systemic response anytime an individual tries to abuse power. They will try to expand their power, and other branches will push back in an attempt to protect their own powers. Madison's argument is a good one, and it still influences how we understand the operation of our government today. But it isn't necessarily a true argument. Madison doesn't know if the system will work as intended. He is just making the best persuasive argument he can. Remember, the values and norms that the citizens bring to bear on the political system matter greatly. The best designed system still requires Republican virtue. So what does this new federal system look like? Power is separated, dispersed into 3 separate branches of government. Each branch has its own constitutional powers, and many powers are shared powers between the branches, which requires them to compromise and work together. The power is physically dispersed and must be practically shared. This results in tyranny being unlikely, avoiding the abuses of power. In addition to the separation of power and checks and balances within the national government, within one level of government, there is also a division and sharing of power between the national government and the states. There are 2 levels of government, further dividing power, further dispersing it, making it less likely that one group will ever control all of the power at one point in time. In a republic, which is what the United States is founded as, the legislative branch is the most powerful and most important branch. The new National Congress will be bicameral, 2 chambers. The purpose of bicameralism is to make tyranny less likely, to further subdivide power within the most powerful branch. The Congress will have lots of power, but 2 different bodies, the Senate and House, must agree for legislation to pass. The U.S. Constitution is the longest-lasting constitution in operation today. It is a good constitution that is worthy of respect and admiration. But let's be clear, it is a flawed, man-made document that can be revised and changed. It did not fall from the sky. It is not a holy document that can't be questioned or criticized. Much of its content is the result of compromises where neither side got what it wanted, and the result isn't necessarily good or true. Many of these compromises had long-term ramifications. There was a bitter dispute over how the states and the people would be represented in the new Congress. Small states wanted equal representation with big states, regardless of population. Big states wanted their influence to match the size of their population. The Great Compromise aims to satisfy both. The upper chamber, the Senate, will have equal representation regardless of population, while the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, will have proportional representation based on population. This compromise arguably gives small states more power than they should have if each citizen's political power is supposed to be equal. For example, In the Senate today, when the chamber debates immigration, gun control, or healthcare, the residents of small states have larger voices than the residents of big states. Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, total population of 5 million, roughly the size of Houston, have as much power as California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania, 115 million people. Think of that what you will. Another infamous compromise at the Constitutional Convention was the Three-Fifths Compromise. Southern states with lots of slaves, which they regarded as property, not people, insisted that they be allowed to count their slaves as people for the purpose of representation in the House. It doesn't matter how stupid the other delegates think this demand is, they have to negotiate or no constitution gets written. The result is the Three-Fifths Compromise. States will be given additional representatives in the House equal to 3/5 of their slave population. So throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when Congress is debating slavery, the southern slaveholding states have more power in Congress than they arguably should. And the slaves who live in those states, in some sense, have representation in Congress. Pro-slavery representation. A third compromise is over voting rights. Some delegates promoted universal white male suffrage from the beginning. All white men can vote. But other delegates thought that was too democratic and insisted on property qualifications. The result is that there is no national standard for voter eligibility. The delegates decide to make voting a state issue so that each state can decide for themselves who is eligible to vote. Think of the ramifications. To return to constitutional design and the perceived excesses of republicanism, understand that the new Constitution is quite elitist and undemocratic. The people are only directly electing one institution within the new government, the House of Representatives, the People's House. Senators are chosen by state legislatures, the President is chosen by the Electoral College, and Supreme Court justices are chosen by the President and the Senate together. A basic way to understand the U.S. Constitution is to follow its gradual democratization. Over time, the right to vote will be extended to more and more people, and the people will begin to choose more and more of their leaders, the direct election of senators, the indirect election of the president. But as we have seen, the Electoral College has its own complications and shortcomings, which perhaps reinforces the point that the Constitution is not perfect, but can be gradually perfected. What would it mean to perfect the Constitution? To address whether or not money is speech, to regulate partisan gerrymandering, to fix the Electoral College, which is fundamentally undemocratic and undermines political equality for voters. Government can't reflect the will of the people unless the system is designed to do so.